This has been one of the most requested videos since I did the Honda Vezel review. Which would you choose? Would it be the previous generation Honda Vezel or would it be the current generation Honda Vezel? Having driven both, I'm going to take you around both of them side by side and let you all compare, but I'm going to do a point system as I go along. Starting with the exterior, walking around both vehicles, you can tell that the new generation Honda Vezel is going with Honda's more angular and boxy design language. The previous generation has a more rounded corner, family-oriented type looking vehicle. Not to say it's a bad looking vehicle because I'm slightly torn between which one looks better. But if I had to give the point, I would give the point to the new generation. And that's because I tend to lean towards a more mean and aggressive looking vehicle. And the new Honda Vezel accomplishes that, especially with that front, that flat front. It almost looks like it doesn't care about aerodynamics. But actually, the new Vezel has a lower drag coefficient than the older one, so it actually goes through the air much easier, even though the front is more angular. Next, let's look at the headlight assembly. Both of them have a type of 3-segment element thing going on with the headlights, where it's 1, 2, 3. The new one has LEDs, the older one does not, even though I'm sure you can put it in aftermarket. On the new one, the daytime running lights and the indicator are in one strip, versus the older one where the daytime running lights are separate and the indicators are to the corner. For this one, I'm going to give both of them 1 point because, like I said, both of them looks nice, especially if you convert the previous generation to all LEDs. Yeah, it looks nice. Wrong back, it's a completely different type of lighting assembly. One, the newer generation has a lighting bar that goes all the way around. Secondly, it's indented. Even though there's a clear piece of plastic on the outside, the interior of the light has some depth to it versus the old generic layout of the previous generation. The previous generation, it looked good on the vehicle, but when compared to the newer generation, the point has to go to the new generation for that lighting bar going all the way around the back and that type of light that they have where it has some depth there. Looking at the interior of the trunk, both of them almost have the same size of trunk. However, on the newer generation, the wheel wells are slightly slimmer, so it gives just a bit more room when it comes to things in the back there. But overall, it's the same depth. They both have a pocket to the rear. On the newer generation, it's narrower but longer. On the previous generation, it's shorter but wider. So I guess 1 point each. Next, the rear seats do fold long flat, and they accomplish this because both of them have that clever way that Honda designed the rear seats to fold long as one complete unit with space below the seats. I said it in the Honda Vezel review. I'm going to say it here again. I love this design. No more fumbling to fold the bottom half forward and pulling the front seat up so the bottom half can fold forward. No, they both fold long as one complete unit, and when they are up, you have room below the seat. When it comes to the build quality and the soft touch materials, both of them have soft touch materials. However, the previous generation one, the one I actually reviewed, that one has a soft touch material, like a kind of suede velvet type feel. The current generation Vezel also has a soft touch material, but it's a different type of material, at least the ones I reviewed. I also love the previous generation speaker cutout with that chrome accent around. The new one doesn't look bad in isolation, but when compared to that chrome accent, yeah, it looks dated. Next, let's look at interior lighting. In the current generation, you have 2 individual star-like LEDs above your head that you cannot control from the rear. The previous generation has the conventional lights in the center with individual switches. I prefer the lighting arrangement of the newer one. However, the newer one doesn't have light switches. So you also have to tell the person in front who's driving or the passenger, turn the light on in the back. Versus the previous generation, if you are the rear and you need light for whatever reason, you can put your hand up and turn your own light on. So the point goes to the previous generation, not for the style, but for having switches. Next, let's look at the dash layout. The previous generation has a doubled-in layout inside the dash, while the current Vezel has that tablet-style display. So the point goes to the current Vezel for having a more updated tablet-style display layout. Next, let's look at the AC controls. On the previous generation, the AC controls were touch-sensitive. On the current generation, they are actual physical buttons. Both have their pros and cons. The pros of an all-digital AC layout is that it looks modern, it looks flashy. However, the cons are, while you're driving and you have to adjust your heat or your vents or whatever you want to adjust, you have to remember to put your hand at a particular point or it simply will not read the command. With buttons, you don't have to put so much brain power into adjusting it. Just feel a wrong button, you turn. However, the wrong buttons do not look as modern as an all-digital AC layout. Next, we have the steering wheels. Both of them are functional. However, on the previous generation, you had buttons lower down. whereas on the newer one, all the buttons are up top where your thumbs are. Next, we have the instrument clusters. On the previous generation, it had a giant analog speed readout, and that was flanked by two small digital screens. On the newer one, they placed the analog speed readout all the way to the right, and the center and the left are all digital. Now the good thing with this is you get more information. Even though the previous generation gave you information like a battery, when you were on hybrid, things like that, because the screens are slightly larger on the newer one and more crisp, you get more information at a glance while driving. Next, we have USB connectivity. On the previous generation, they had like a sub-shelf below the center console where you had an HDMI, a cigarette lighter or power outlet, and the USB. On the newer one, they have the power outlet below and they have the USB and the charger up top. Both the current and previous generation Honda Vezel both have electronic park and brake and brake hold, but the previous generation has a dedicated sport button. So while the current generation you have to cycle through normal eco sport, on the previous generation you had a sport button, you just hit it, boop, and you are in sport mode. When it comes to your gear selector, on the previous generation you had a more complicated shift by wire system. On the newer generation you just pull from park to reverse to neutral to drive. On the previous generation, you had to push to the right, then pull down for drive, or push to the right and push up for neutral, and you had a dedicated park button. That's because on the previous generation, you had the problematic dual clutch transmission. On the current generation, there really isn't a transmission. It's all done via the motor generator 1 and 2. Next, we have the main lighting for the front of the cabin. The previous generation actually had a nicer layout. For example, you had these small lights here you can turn on or off, but then you had bigger lights that you can turn on and off. On the current generation, they are just two big lights. There are no smaller lights, they are just those two big lights, and I guess it serves the same purpose, but the previous generation had a nicer layout. The previous Honda Vezel was powered by a 1.5 litre Dreams engine that had 150 horsepower and 140 foot-pounds of torque, and it sent power to the wheels via a 7-speed dual clutch transmission. That was the weak point of the previous generation, that dual clutch transmission. The new Honda Vezel is powered by a 1.5 litre engine. Gone is the Dreams technology. It has less horsepower, 129, but it has more low-end torque at 187 foot-pounds of torque versus the 140 that the previous generation Vezel had. The new Honda Vezel shows that Honda has learned from its mistakes, because gone is the Dreams technology of the last 1.5 litre engine that has gone, and gone is the extremely problematic dual clutch transmission. Anybody will tell you the dual clutch transmission was the weak point of the previous generation Honda Vezel. And that being the case, Honda learned from their mistakes, and that is why the current generation Honda Vezel doesn't even have a transmission. It has a single speed system where the engine and motor generator 1 and 2 works together to send power to the wheels. Now both are similarly silent when in EV mode, but some people have asked to hear how the engine sung when they are idling. So let's hear the engines idling one by one. Without a decibel meter, I can't tell for sure, but just listening to both engines, I think the previous generation Vezel engine ran quieter. The current generation has a louder, more raspy sound to it. The previous generation was just like a normal engine. But what do they drive like? Well, starting with the previous generation has that problematic dual clutch transmission. You feel it from the moment you start to drive the vehicle. You can get accustomed to it, but those who don't know, you have to hit the accelerator pedal slightly more. It shudders at slow speeds. You are unable to modulate the speed when you are just creeping up a hill. People who bought this vehicle as a first vehicle, you all may think that is how all vehicles drive. That is not how all vehicles drive. In a normal automatic transmission, you would likely press on the accelerator pedal and the car will either creep forward or creep backward, depending on if you have it in drive or reverse. This kind of dual clutch engagement, disengagement song, I never liked it. I never like how it feels. I don't like how it drives. Putting dual clutch transmissions in non-performance vehicles is a waste of time. And thankfully Honda and all realize that, because in the current generation, there's no dual clutch transmission. As a matter of fact, there are no transmissions at all, the direct drive system. So you can inch forward and inch rearward, however slow you want, uphill, downhill, it just flows. But once you get up and going with both Vezels, they drive similarly in terms of how they handle the road. They are composed over bumps and road imperfections. They don't feel underpowered. The only difference I can see is that the current generation stays in EV mode a bit longer. You can drive from 0 to about 55-60 kph in EV mode with the current generation. The previous generation hops across the engine power a bit sooner, and that can also be down to the fact that the previous generations are older vehicles, so the battery pack doesn't have the amount of life it once had. Or it could mean that Honda actually improved on the current Vezel, allowing it to drive in EV mode for a longer period at a higher speed compared to the previous generation. All in all, I would say both vehicles, past and current generations, are both solid vehicles. If you are getting either to buy, take the opportunity. Even though I would say try your best to maybe get a newer one, because the past one had some issues that Honda has learned from, which is why they no longer have a dual clutch transmission or the Dreams technology engine. But if you are getting a good one in the previous generation to buy, good mileage, well maintained, take it. It's a solid vehicle. If not, you're not going to roll those dice, buy the newer one. More tech, better fuel economy, and it looks nicer. Now, people often comment and ask, why don't I ever touch on fuel economy? And that's because it varies too widely. I like to speak on things that I can show, I can prove, I can quantify without a shadow of a doubt. I can tell you which vehicle is bigger, which vehicle is smaller. However, I can tell you I got 550 kilometers on a 40-liter tank. And a new body vehicle and your driving style is different. You live in a traffic-filled area, you probably have to go 10 miles uphill, and then you only get 250 and you wonder, but wait, TD47 line to me, which I am not. So just know, both vehicles are fuel efficient, and the newer one is even more fuel efficient than the previous generation.